Thank you everyone for joining me again, joining us again this Thursday evening for our week 3 of our 4-week Italian course. Thank you once more to our guests for this evening, Alistair from the UK and Dr. who's joining us from Tuscany this evening, well this morning. So welcome guys, thank you for coming.
Yes, I'm going to unmute myself. Thank you. Great to be here from a sunny England. As I was just saying, some of you guys will have heard, we're having great weather here. So again, this is a fantastic way to start the day at 9:30. Paula's an hour ahead, so she's the lucky one. She can actually probably drink without feeling too bad, but I'm looking forward to this one. We've got some great times. So yeah, again, thank you. And thank you to Paula for joining us. She's going to be able to talk us through her fantastic wines that we fell in love with, Mark and I, when we were in Tuscany last year. So we're really excited to have you here. So thanks for joining us, Paula.
Yes, I'm really happy to be here. And so, yeah, it's a beautiful day here in Tuscany too, but we've been having fantastic weather. So everything's looking great here. Yeah.
Brilliant.
I'd just like to add as well, obviously we're really lucky to have Paula here, so we'd love to open up the floor. If anyone has any questions they'd like to ask, please do just flag yourself either via the chat, or you can raise your hand, or just flick your question over in the chat and we can put it to Paula that way.
So again, just a few ground rules for this evening. We will we'll be running for around about an hour this evening, so we don't want to go too long. Questions are, of course, as Luke said, absolutely encouraged. Just ask to have yourself taken off mute, or you can actually take yourselves off mute. Ali and I will be running through some of the basics, but in all honesty, we're going to be talking to Paula about her wines, the first 2 of which are in this lineup this evening. So I'm just going to get us started, again, just getting us back into the mindset of being in Italy. So we're going to get started on our quick little run through our slides here. Obviously, again, we've got the map of Italy to run through. For those of you who don't know the precise geography of Tuscany, you find it just north of Rome and northwest of Rome. And I've got a little map here of the Chianti region. One thing that really got me visiting Chianti, and it was the first time I visited Chianti when we met Paula last year, was the sheer size of the Tuscany region, the state of Tuscany, but also the Chianti region. It is genuinely enormous. It's absolutely huge. So it's obviously a very, very wide region in regards to climate and to different hillsides, sun exposures. Some areas are relatively dry. Some areas have a lot more rainfall. Some are inland, closer to the mountains. Some are near the coast. So you have a lot of variation, but there's one thing you don't have a lot of variation in, and that's grape variety. So today we're tasting 3 Sangiovese wines, 100% Sangiovese. And so we're going to be talking, this is the first time in this tasting, the only time in this set of tastings where we're talking about one grape variety so exclusively. However, you will find that there are some pretty key differences between the 3 wines that we're going to be trying this evening. So we'll come back to this map to see where we are within Tuscany throughout the evening, throughout the tasting. But first, we're going to just run through a very brief history of Tuscany. So Toscana, which is the local name for Tuscany, is actually responsible for a lot of modern Italy's literature, language, art, and it was the Etruscans, which is where the name Toscana, Etrusca, came from. They built a central role in building this basically culture of Italy, of central Italy. And so many Italians, they look to Tuscany as being a very central core part of being Italian and their kind of self-image of their culture. So, and it is such a breathtaking, beautiful part of the world. Let's just do a quick show of hands so that Paula can see as well. A quick show of hands as to how many people have been to Tuscany before. That is a lot of hands.
Amazing.
Holy cow. Fantastic.
How am I supposed to see everybody?
So you can click the little grid if you hover over the video. But let's just say there was a lot of hands there.
There we go. Okay, yeah, but still no.
Lots of people.
Lots of people. And that's not a shock. So as I've said here in the last paragraph there, it's Tuscany today is definitely known more for its tourism rather than for its new forms of art or literature. So, but that's absolutely fine in its own way. And it's obviously also known for its wine. So medieval Tuscany was actually very formative throughout Italy for setting a lot of rules for winemaking. So we know a huge amount about the medieval winemaking procedures within Tuscany, and it's mainly due to the power that Florence had. Florence was one of the major capitals of Italy, of that region. It had a lot of power in regards to the huge military might and economics. It was an absolute powerhouse, huge trading city. So, and here we actually have the earliest records of wine merchants. So not just wineries that have been around for centuries, not just grapes, but actual merchants, people who sold wine for a living. And that was back in 1079, which is pretty incredible. And they were, of course, they were so popular within Florence that the first guild of wine traders was developed in 1282. So here's a quick little question. So here's where RSA began. So how old do you think you had to be to drink wine in medieval Florence? What do we think? So feel free to chat. You can speak up. You can, whatever you'd want to do.
12?
Ali says 12. Okay, interesting. 12.
Nick and Margaret are saying 12. Tony, 8.
8?
8.
What?
Phil, 10.
10, 8, 12. Okay.
We have a second 8.
Second 8. Okay, good. So I can tell you they were a lot more responsible than you give them credit for. It was 15. The age was 15, which is actually pretty close to the legal drinking age now. So 15 was the age. There was no one under the age of 15 was allowed to drink wine in these wine merchant houses. How they enforced it.
What is it now? What is it now, Mark? Do you know?
16.
Or Paula, do you know what it is now?
It's 16.
Is it 16?
So basically there's never really been any kind of like official rule, and then basically what's happened is that mainly in cities now they actually have put rules, and it's actually 18. Yeah.
18.
Yeah. In cities, right? So you can still, I mean, in rural Tuscany, you can still walk into a bar when you're 14 and 15 and ask for a beer and drink it, right?
And no one can stop you, yeah.
Yeah, because there's not actually an enforced legal age of drinking. But in the cities, because kids started abusing alcohol in the cities and nightclubs and bars and stuff like that, they have had to put a limit, yeah.
Cool.
So yeah, so 15, and so it's been kind of similar to that today. So they were pretty far ahead of their time in Florence. So that's just the basic history of the region that we're in the capital, Florence. So now we're gonna go to our first wine. So hopefully everyone's got a glass of the first one, the Limicina Chianti Classico, the 2017 vintage. Now I wanted to just show this little image. So you've got the Toscana region, the little section at the top here, that's the greater Tuscany region. And we actually go closer here into the Chianti Classico region, which is where Paula is actually coming from this evening / morning her time. She is from a region called Ghiaula in Chianti, which you'll see just in the south of this area here. A very, very, very beautiful region. So I was going to say, Paula, would you mind just running us through what makes your little sub-region of Chianti Classico so special?
Yeah, of course. So basically, I think what a lot of people don't realize is exactly a little bit like how you were saying, Mark, just how big the Chianti Classico region is, and also the Chianti region in general. The difference between the two also. So Chianti Classico being the original area of production of this typical regional wine. And so the Chianti Classicos always have the black rooster, which is a symbol of quality. And then within Chianti Classico, we have lots of different communes, and each one kind of has its particular climate and kind of typicity. Gaiole, which is actually further south, is actually colder than what's further north, and it's simply a question of altitude. So as you move down the Chianti Classico area, you're actually going higher into the hills. And this altitude actually gives us cooler night temperatures, higher acidity in the wines, so a lot more freshness and less alcohol. So usually in Gaiole and Chianti, you're looking at wines that have a bit more complexity, a little bit more minerality, kind of rather than the northern areas, which are more fruit and dense and more alcohol strong. And so it says my internet's unstable. Am I still okay?
Yeah, you sound absolutely fine.
Perfect. Okay. So in Gaiole and Chianti, where I'm situated, we're at 410 meters. An example is it's about 24 degrees in the day, and it's 7 degrees at night right now in May.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah. So this big difference in temperature lasts throughout the season in this area, which really gives the wines a kind of nice freshness to them. Sangiovese is already known for its acidity and the kind of freshness you feel in your cheeks, but in Gaiole and Chianti in particular, you get even more of that sensation.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for that, Paula. So that's a perfect introduction to Sangiovese, what we have here. And Paula touched on the thing that defines Sangiovese to me, and that's freshness. That really is that elevated acidity. And it's funny, we're making more and more in Australia. We're making more and more Sangiovese wines in multiple different regions because we're trying everything at the moment, I think. And we're yet to get this freshness, this absolutely driving, refreshing acidity that really cleans the mouth as you're drinking it.
Yeah, I think for me, when the thing that's really struck me when we came to see you, Paula, was we're talking about freshness, and for me it's not just freshness, it's vibrancy. It seems to be they're wines that are alive, because freshness, implies just acidity sometimes, but what I really adored, what we loved about your wine, was this vibrancy and sort of flesh behind the wine. So there's medium bodied, and they're wines that can be drunk. What I love about them is they can be drunk young, but they certainly have the ability to age, and that's quite not always an easy thing to have, a wine that can be drunk beautifully in its youth, but is going to have years to come. How do you, do you feel the same, and how do you manage that?
So basically, I would have to agree that the kind of thing for me when I arrived in Chianti Classico was I wanted to make drinkable wines, because people love opening a bottle that they've just bought and putting it straight in the glass and not having to wait 10 years for it, right? Yeah. So being able to make that kind of product, but that still can actually last a long time. So finding that balance between, okay, how do I make sure I've got the fruit and the vibrancy, like you were saying, and the acidity that's available now, and still have a wine that can last a long time. For me, it's all about the kind of the tannins. And so therefore, for me, it's making sure I leave the fruit hanging long enough to get that kind of tannin development and ripeness, which allows the tannins to be less aggressive in their youth, right? So the other thing is trying to not extract too many tannins, because that's what tends to make wines less friendly in their youth, is the tannins. The intensity of the tannins is just makes the wine difficult and hard to approach in its youth. And you say, okay, well, I can't drink this now. I got to put it away 5, 10 years.
Yeah.
So basically less oak also keeps more of that fruit available to you.
Yeah.
Whereas, of course, the other thing is that making sure that I pick early enough not to lose the acidity, but it's usually never a problem here at Le Micine, just because of those cool nights. It's basically, for me, year in, year out, doesn't matter whether it's hot, dry, cold, sunny, cloudy, the acidity is there. And I think it's also this altitude in the soil and just that night and day temperature that guarantees it season, like throughout seasons, you know, it just does not change. I think it's just a typicity of my place.
Yeah.
Other regions where climate change is actually causing them to have to pick earlier, they're getting more aggressive tannins and they're also losing acidity. So it's all a delicate kind of balance.
There's
Brilliant.
definitely no loss of acidity here. And you touched on soil there, Paula. And I have to just point out this image that I've put up on the screen here, which is obviously you in your vineyard when Ali and I visited last year. And the one thing that I'll point out to everyone that really truly blew me away, and the entire reason that I wanted to put this image up, was because if you look at the soil, under Paula's feet, it's alive. We were there in March, so it was not quite springtime. There weren't quite. There was maybe a few little buds on the vines there, but it was still very, very early days. But you could see genuinely there was life within the vineyard. And if you look past to the vineyard across, so first of all, you can see distinctly this huge down and up slope where there's these amazing rolling hills up and down, which is indicative of this region of Chianti Classico. But also, can you see any green whatsoever in the vineyard across? And I asked the question to Paula when I was taking this photo, kind of tongue in cheek, was so who owns that vineyard? Because it was definitely not hers. Yes, and it's her neighbor that owns that vineyard. But it genuinely looks across there. It looks like the surface of the moon. It is just so dead and just dry and cold. And a lot of that has to do with the way that Paula manages her soil and her viticulture. So would you mind touching on that a little bit, Paula?
Yeah, of course. For me, my kind of philosophy in the vineyard has been to find a natural balance and between the vines, the soil, the environment. So I do everything organic. So everything's certified organic, and I've been doing that since I arrived in Italy in 2010. And when I arrived, Le Micine looked like that vineyard that you've got across the hill. It was not alive, and for me, I was like, oh my goodness, no, I have to turn this around. So by working the soil less, not using herbicides, allowing the grass to grow between the rows. You know, some people, you know, come here and they're like, oh, it's not very neat. And I'm like, well, nature is not neat, you know? So, you know, the fact that that grass grows there, there's usually a reason. I mean, I've got tons of clovers that just spontaneously grow in the vineyard, and clovers bring nitrogen to the soil. And they bring nitrogen to the soil when it's missing nitrogen. So there's this natural, I mean, there's this natural kind of balance that forms when you intervene less. So that was my whole idea, was, okay, how can I express this land, this territory, be more sustainable, respect nature. My vineyards are full of insects. Everybody's like, oh wow, there's bees, there's ladybugs. I'm like, well, yeah, because I'm not trying to kill off everything. I'm trying to get this natural balance in the vineyard. So very little work in the soil. Everything's done by hand. The pruning's manual, the picking is manual. All of our summer pruning is manual. Everything is done by hand by myself and 2 employees. And then for the treatments, we're using the least amount possible to protect our vines. We don't usually have a lot of disease in Chianti Classico because it's quite dry. So there's no irrigation. So we're not watering our vines. It's just natural rainfall that comes in the winter and the springtime and in the fall. The summers tend to be dry, which is basically low humidity. So not a lot of problems with disease.
Which just is so interesting, because the entire reason a winemaker, or a viticulturalist, I should say, would spray so heavily to make a vineyard look like that one does in the background of this image here, is because there's a lot of risk of fungus, of disease, of insects. So if you're finding that it just kind of naturally figures itself out, and truly, I mean, this area has been a winemaking region for at least 1,000 years, so they didn't have pesticides back then, and it worked pretty well. So I find it interesting that big scale viticulture has made it so clearly into a lot of areas of county, and it's so fantastic. I was so refreshed to walk through your vineyard and see bees buzzing around and grasshoppers and things like that, and was really impressed by
I think, again, I think for me, I think that going back to what I was saying earlier, Paul, about the vibrancy in the wines, that for me is the difference between just freshness, but vibrancy and a feeling of being alive. And for me, that comes from the biodiversity in your vineyard. And that was something that really did shine through. So I think they're really linked, the vibrancy of the fruit and the biodiversity.
Paula, as we potentially move on to wine number 2, and having read a little bit more about your story, and you mentioned you've been in Tuscany for now 10 years, I think it'd be really interesting to get an idea of how you came into winemaking. Obviously, your accent, from what I detect, isn't quite native Italian, and how you ended up in Tuscany.
Yeah, of course. I'm originally from Montreal, Canada. So I grew up in Quebec. So, being Canadian and becoming a winemaker also is quite a big contrast. So our climate is very rigid and cold. But I grew up with Italian heritage. So my mom is of Italian origin. My dad is actually Scottish. So I've always had this fascination with Europe, with Italy. My dad, who is a wine lover, always had great bottles of wine around the house. So legal drinking age at my house was 11. So
Bit like mine.
Yeah.
So I started early, basically tasting wines, putting my nose in them, discovering them. So it was always kind of something that I grew up with. And when I basically got to around 16, 17, I had done a couple of trips to Italy. I wanted to learn Italian. I wanted to move here one day. My parents were like, okay, once you finish university, you can move to Italy. So I had to decide what I wanted to do. And I wasn't quite sure. So, but luckily I came upon this program in agriculture. And I started that, and I loved it. Being in contact with nature, outside, learning about plants, the physiology, the biology, everything behind it. And I was like, okay, how do I put this together with Italy? And so wine was obviously kind of the opportunity to bring Italy and agriculture together. So I looked for a study program in Europe, and I found a master's in viticulture and enology. So I started that in 2006. And so I decided to move to Europe. I started in France. I did a semester in Italy. It was absolutely a dream come true, because it was the perfect combination of, art, creativity, nature, science, languages. I mean, wine for me was just the perfect subject for someone like me who loves to travel, learn languages, be in contact with nature. And I mean, it just felt like it had chosen me, It was kind of I wasn't sure what to do with my life, and this kind of came on my path, and it ended up being perfect.
Amazing.
Fantastic.
And then once I finished, I was living in Italy, and as a young Canadian woman, it was actually very hard to find a job. So you can imagine, Tuscany's history, which we talked about, is very long. Lots of traditions there. Very masculine industry here in Italy. So with all the enthusiasm and all the passion and all the sacrifices and all the energy I had to be in the wine business, I was just getting a lot of doors shut on my face. So it was very, very tough. And I honestly was thinking about going back to Canada. I was like, well, if there's no opportunities for me here, I can't just stay here and sit around and doing nothing. So I'll go back to Canada. But my parents and my mentors, they encouraged me. They said, Paula, after everything you've done, why don't you look for an estate, a few hectares of land, and start your own business, your own vineyard. At the time, it seemed crazy. At the time, I said, oh, Dad, Mom, come on, I can't do that. It's going to be so much work. And they said, well, take the time and look and see. And the more I thought about it, the more I talked to people, I guess the people around me that knew me, they were like, Paula, if there's somebody that can do this, it's you. You put your mind to it and you're going to throw yourself in it and you can do it. You love it. You're passionate. You've got the energy. Why not? You're 24. You've got nothing to lose. And so it was fantastic. I had the right people around me. It was a good time. Well, bad time, let's say. It was after the crisis in the US in 2008, 2009. So Italy was struggling a lot and there were lots of estates for sale. So it ended up being an opportunity. And so I found Limicine in late 2009. And within a few months, banks, parents, friends, everybody was helping me to get the estate. And so I got the loans. My parents helped me out and I bought the estate in 2010.
Mm.
Amazing.
And I think, again, your energy really shines through in all of this. It's a lovely story. And, always great to see the people behind the wines. And as I say, your energy really shines through on everything you do.
And I'll just say that we're very, very glad that your parents and your mentors did talk you into staying, because without that, we wouldn't have these marvelous wines. So just to give everyone a bit of a mental image of where we are, this image that you find on your screen here is of Limicine. So you drive up the driveway, which is just in the bottom of the screen here. And where Paula is right now, from what I can see from where we had a tasting with her, was in this little front building down the front. And then you've got the winemaking facility up around the back. So a tiny, tiny little speck of a winery, but a beautiful, beautiful part of the world. The focus is obviously almost entirely on the vines themselves. I was blown away by how little Paula actually does in the winery. She doesn't add things. She doesn't adjust that much. It's just kind of, I don't think there's cooling or heating within your winemaking facility up at the top of the hill, is there?
No. So I know. So that was the kind of, I did all my studies in viticulture and enology. We talk about all the science, the yeast, the fermentations, the temperature control, and being able to actually do without all of those technologies, for me, was kind of a return to how things were, and also allows the wine itself and the microclimate and Limicine to show through more. The less you control, the more it's the personality of the wine showing through. So exactly, very limited equipment, stainless steel tanks, my hands, the hands of my, employees, and that's about it. A few pumps, and that's all. So no temperature control, just naturally the cool nights. We harvest in October, so that would probably be the equivalent of even kind of March, April for you in Australia. So quite late harvesting. So in the day could be 20 degrees, and at night in October I've had 2 degrees sometimes, 4 degrees sometimes, and that keeps my cellar cool and my tanks cool.
Fantastic. So would you mind just running through? So I think everyone's pretty much moved on to the second wine here, which is the Riserva. So would you mind just running us through what the difference is between your Chianti Classico, and then we move up into the Riserva?
Mm-hmm. So basically, hey, there we go, show and tell. So we have a kind of pyramid of quality. So the Chianti Classico is kind of the base of the pyramid. And then we have the Riserva, which is the mid-level, and then the Gran Selezione. So basically, having a DOCG, so the Denominazione di Origine, the kind of seal that you have on the top of the bottles, is a way to guarantee the quality, the typicity of the product. And we have rules to follow. So of course, I'm free to do my viticulture how I want. I'm free to do my fermentations how I want. I'm free to represent my typicity as I feel best. The choice of oak or no oak is up to us completely, but there are some basic rules given by the appellation. So the most important basic rule is 80% minimum Sangiovese in the wines, and then also minimum 1 year of aging for the Chianti Classico and minimum 2 years of aging for the Riserva. And this basically also, once I've made my wines, it's not just, okay, great, Paula, go ahead, bottle it. No, I have to call the association of the denomination of origin and submit the wine to a committee that's made, who's trained to judge Chianti Classico. And then there's another committee that's judged for Riserva. So basically, it's not as if I say, hey, I'm going to, age my Chianti 2 years and now it's a Riserva. So it's really got to be quality difference. So our Chianti Classico usually is coming from the lower areas of the vineyard, where we get bigger fruit, which means they're more juicy, more kind of lighter fruit flavors, easier drinking, whereas the Riserva is coming from the top hills. So the top hills are more exposed to the sun. And also, if you imagine, we're not irrigating. So when it rains, the water from the top goes to the bottom. So the top areas do tend to be more arid, which makes the grape smaller. So more concentration, more sugars, more tannins. So picking those grapes separately and then aging them 2 years in oak barrels, you're just going to have a bit more depth in the wine. The nose, the flavors are going to be more intense and more rich.
And do you make a Riserva every vintage, Paula, or does it depend? And how have your recent vintages been?
So I make a Riserva, yes, every vintage. With the 7 hectares that I have, I've identified different areas across the vineyards, and I basically pick quality-wise each area. And then even in the fermentations, I already know, like, it's the soil, the grapes that give me already the product before I ferment it. So I know kind of from the taste of the grapes which ones. But what is rather changing, for example, is that in some years, the top of the hill might be too arid because of climate change.
Yeah.
So basically, sometimes I'll pick an area and then I'll realize that, wow, okay, this is actually less balanced. It's got more tannins than I expected. It's a bit more aggressive. And so, but things are changing. And then basically by doing small pickings of different areas, I'm always able to get different qualities. And then I decide only after the aging, only after the final stages, how to blend them to create the Riserva and the Chianti Classico. Okay. More recently, I've actually struggled to make the Chianti Classico because sometimes my grapes are so good, even in the low areas, it's hard to get drinking Chianti Classico. It tends to be more full-bodied than I would want it to be. I'd want something easier. So that's what I could be seeing, yeah.
Okay, great. And then I think we just had a question from Nick about what oak are you using? Big oak bottle? Are you using small barrels? Is it a blend? Is it a mixture of the two?
So I'm using exactly a bit of both. I use mostly French oak, some Hungarian. I have two big kind of, what do they call them in English? The kind of botti.
Food.
Pozzi, yeah, Pozzi, yeah. We use the Italian word, we'd use botti really, or foudre if you're in France.
Okay, yeah, so we use the big botti of about 4,000 liters, mainly for the Chianti Classico, whereas for the Reserva, we're using 350-liter barrels. Most are not new, so we're only using about 5-10% new oak in any of our wines.
Okay, yeah, and that comes through. It's all about the fruit. I mean, the whole way the world has viewed oak has changed dramatically, I think, in the past decade, and I think rightly so. Oak can add so much, but it can really overpower. And certainly, again, in your wines, certainly here the oak is not overpowering. It's really well integrated.
Yeah. So just throwing it out to the crowd here to keep a bit of interaction moving. So can we see? So I know I definitely can see the jump up in complexity, in richness, layers of flavor, and it's very, very interesting what you're saying about the oak there, Paula, because I really can't see usually what I would expect when you go from a Chianti Classico to a Riserva. You expect there to be a layer of oak, like a lick of oak put in through there to kind of almost make you sure that you know you're in Riserva. But this, I don't think it doesn't have it, and I don't think it needs it, because the fruit there shows that it has those extra layers already. And I almost feel like putting too much oak on that would kind of cover it over. You know, it's kind of paint over it a little bit, and I think it would lose something. So.
And there's a lovely density. For me, it's a density that's added in this fruit that there wasn't perhaps in the Classico. There's that feeling of concentration and power, but not from the oak, but just from the density and concentration of the fruit. So
I'm interested to potentially open it up to the floor here and see if people can see the real difference between the 16 and the 17 and the Reserva and that oak coming through. Obviously, you don't have to kind of unmute and say so, but just to get a nice bit of engagement, what are people's thoughts?
I think the Reserva is an absolute step up, not just in fruit and concentration of fruit. You have that, but you've also got, I think, a subtle step up in oak as well. But it's subtle so that it's not an oak-driven increase in concentration. It's fruit-driven with a commensurate oak. It's a very nice wine, beautifully balanced.
I'd agree with everything you say, Graham. That's absolutely spot on.
Absolutely. Thank you, Graham. Anyone would think he'd worked for the Australian wine industry for, what was it, 40 years or something.
And actually, Paula, I going back to that, so we've had, how about vintages, difference between 16 and 17?
That's true. 16 was a fabulous vintage. It was such a good vintage. I mean, for Chianti Classico, it just was kind of the perfect balance between the fruit, the ripeness, the vibrancy with the acidity. And then one thing in particular, it was really cold during the harvest. So I remember that my harvesters showed up with Converse shoes on their feet, and it was 2 degrees that morning. You know, so these harvesters, they were all students from Siena, and they were freezing. And I mean, it was funny because it was just, they had shown up so badly equipped, and that coldness during the harvest gave these perfumes to the wine in 216 that were just fabulous. Yeah. And it's that kind of, I mean, you don't smell anything kind of cooked or too hot in this wine. And that's, you get this elegance of the aromas. And yet, because the season was so good, the fruit is ripe. So you've got the aromas of what would seem like a cool vintage. You've got the fruit that would be of a warm vintage, and the tannins too, that have that suppleness that is also typical, right? So you manage, it's like the perfect combination of I tend to prefer the cooler vintages because I like that kind of sharp acidity, the kind of freshness, the kind of even a little bit of herbaceous for me. I love it more than dense fruit, whereas this has got kind of both coming together.
Yeah, Paula, we're getting so much love for the Reserva. You should be really proud of that. It's drinking fantastically. Liz had a really good question, and I think you're probably a really good person to ask this about, in terms of returning from the old days of winemaking, and what new techniques do you use to try and get your wines as to how they are?
New techniques that I use to get my wines the way they are. So I think one thing that many people have told me about my winemaking style is that it's traditional but clean, right? So maybe, once upon a time, traditional wines were also kind of rustic, right? So there wasn't that kind of cleanness in terms of aromas, and that is something that for me, okay, I'm not using techniques, but the thing that we've learned in science is you got to keep your cellar clean, you got to keep your barrels clean, you got to keep your tanks clean, your pumps, and also your fruit. So that's probably one of these newer kind of technologies that is so important. For me, I find that we're all talking about using less sulfites, more natural wines, but one thing for me that you can't sacrifice is that cleanly, like you've worked so hard, nature has created these aromas for you, and just having spoilage yeast or spoilage microorganisms or things that can make your wine smell less kind of, I would say net. I don't know if you did it anyway.
I think you're just, everything that to me that you just said, and it can be summed up in 3 words, and that again is so evident when we saw you, is attention to detail. You're really caring and harvesting different crops and taking care of your wine to prevent that, let's say, rusticity. It's care and love, really, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Right now, coronavirus has been bad for my business because I don't have tourists, I don't have tastings, I don't have my villa rentals, but every day I'm out in the vineyards. And for me, it's fantastic. I'm touching my vines, I'm learning about them, I'm getting back into my vineyards, and it's like the early days when I was doing most of the work myself. And so it's for me, it's like kind of curing my soul, it's been a tough time. I've been closed up. We haven't been able to go out. My vines have been giving me kind of that energy. And so it's, I guess, more attention. Previously, in traditional wines, there wasn't, you kind of just planted the vineyards and let them be, right? So I am not intervening too much, but I'm helping them along the way. So the pruning, doing it very carefully, basically not putting down too much fertilizer, so that I'm not having to remove too many buds. I'm not having to remove grapes. So all these things are very important. Yeah.
Fantastic, Paula. I legitimately remember when Ali and I left your beautiful little estate. I remember Ali and I having that exact discussion, using almost those exact words.
Yeah.
A lot of those wines, because they are traditional, but they are clean. They are absolutely clean. And one thing that I remember, those of you who joined us last week when we were talking about the wines of Piemonte and Nebbiolo in particular, one of the absolute stipulations that we have as a company in United Cellars is it's got to show a sense of place. Absolutely. It's got to have a tradition, and you've got to be able to know where it comes from. It has to have what the French would call terroir. However, the Australian palate requires wines to not be too funky, rustic, old school. So your wines absolutely fit that just so absolutely precisely. So they are looking so good over on this side of the world. They're looking amazing.
Same on this side.
So Luke, any other questions for Paula?
Yeah, we've got a really great question from Phil, actually. He said, from what you've said, Paula, you've taken a fresh approach to your winemaking, especially based on the kind of tradition that Chianti has. And I guess this could be opened up to Ali and Mark as well. Are other regions doing the same thing? What sort of trajectory are we looking at with the other regions that we've looked at and the other regions in Italy in general?
Do you mean by the other people within the region or other regions?
I'm assuming what Phil asked was through both within Tuscany and then more broadly, within Piedmonte and other regions of Italy.
So I could answer one part of that very, very easily and very non-ironically. I mean, we had an appointment with one of your contemporaries, Paula, before we came to see you. And I remember as we left that place, it was a place that we were considering taking on as an estate that we would import into Australia. And as Ali and I left, we were kind of looking at each other and kind of had the same idea. These guys are, there's no evolution. There's no, they're in a very, very warm area, and you could see the vines were really struggling. As Paula said, there's no irrigation allowed. So the vines were really struggling. The wines were very high alcohol. There was a bit of volatile acidity. They didn't look like traditional Chiantis. They looked like big, blousy, kind of not very nice wines, really. And then we came to Limicine, and we were just like, oh my God, this is amazing. This was just incredible. So, and this was a place that was, I think I drove that day. So I think it was 12.5 kilometers away from Limicine. So
yeah,
over the hill, not a very far way at all. However, there are people in the direct, not necessarily her direct neighbours, but in the vicinity of where Limicine is. And I would say all throughout Tuscany, who are not paying any attention whatsoever to a changing climate, to the changing fashions of what people want from wine, potentially. But yeah, so it's absolutely happening. Yeah.
But Paula, are you still seen as some kind of a foreign maverick that's come in and to change up things? How do the locals and contemporaries see you now and take to your sort of fresh, precise approach?
So, I mean, definitely this is going to be my 11th harvest, So at the beginning, I mean, it was absolutely a complete kind of rejection of me, who I was, what I represented, what I wanted to do, because it was like, I was actually exactly kind of thinking of making traditional style wines was like, are you crazy? Right? And I remember them telling me, if you don't hire a winemaker, you're not going to get anywhere. Who do you think you are, little Canadian girl, trying to make... We've been here 300 years. What do you think you're going to do, right? And then now, as time went by, I have journalists calling me and they're like, how did you come up with this? Right? And I'm like, I didn't come up with this. I mean, I just came in and into a region that's got 300 years of history. And I said, how can I respect this and still make something unique? And for me, that was my formula, was my background. So being young, being a woman, being Canadian, everything that I learned from visiting producers in France, Italy, Spain, Switzerland, right? A combination of all that I learned and what I retained from my studies, and then figuring out how best to represent Sangiovese in its purity, right? And so nowadays, you can really tell that like they've kind of said, okay, wow, things have shifted, and now you see this new energy even in Chianti Classico and Consorzio, of Candy Classico, they always send me people. They're like, you should go see Paula. You should go see Paula. She loves Candy Classico. She loves the Black Rooster. You know, she's doing great wines. She's young. She's one of our, you know, best producers. And it's so night and day from what it was at the beginning, which was, you know, what do you think you're doing, to, wow, I mean, this is the future of Candy Classico. We need to encourage this. We need to get, and you're seeing people, and to get back to the question, yes, like, I have two neighbors up in Rada, Angela Fronti of Istine and Diego Finocchi of Lerta di Radda. They're in their 30s, two young people that have, you know, started up their own vines, their own vineyards, their own wineries. And you see there's this kind of shift, and it's like they're getting mentions, they're getting pointed out. And I think Candy Classico realizes, wow, we need this new energy. We need this kind of to get us back kind of on the map, you know, because Candy Classico, you kind of think of Chianti, oh, that's kind of, you know, kind of a wine for, you know, people of the past. No, it's actually not, right? Candy Classico is so many different communes, so many different subtleties, so many things to learn about it, so much variety in terms of flavor. There's something for everyone.
And
Brilliant.
Really,
thank you very much.
As we're saying, yeah. So, Paula, thank you so much for all your answers. This is amazing. I've just realised we're skirting close to the hour deadline I've set myself. So we may move on to our third and final wine for the evening, if that's okay. So, Luke, any final questions while we move on to this last?
Just a very brief one for Paula. If you could tell us a kind of peak drinking age on both of those. We've had a question about that.
Great question.
So for me, I basically say usually a max of 5 to 6 years from the vintage on the Chianti Classico. So your 17 will go to 2022, 2023. And then for the Reserva, I opened up the other night at Reserva 211, and it was absolutely fabulous. So these can definitely go 10 years, but I'm finding between 6 and 8 is really a good time. So that would be your 16, 2024 to 2026. But, you know, if you want to drink them now, go ahead. And
Good luck. They're not lasting in my house that long.
yeah, they're fabulous now too. So
yeah, absolutely. So
Brilliant.
We're going to move on to a little area to the south of the region. I'm just going to quickly go back to the map, which is just here. So we're going to visit a little place called Montalcino. So it's one of the southernmost regions of the whole Chianti area, and Montalcino is it's basically one mountain. So we're trying this one here, the Val di Suga, which is made by a very, very, very talented winemaker called Andrea Lonardi, who works for a very, very big company that it's called Bertani, very, very well established company up in Valpolicella. And this wine is it's like his pet project. It's his little favorite pet project. Now he sources grapes from a multitude of different areas along the mountain of Montalcino. And he makes, I think he makes, Ali, do you remember, was it 4 wines or 5 wines that he makes?
Well, to be honest, I don't know exactly. Either 4 or 5. You're absolutely right. It's one of the two. It might be 5. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think he makes one from each of the sub-regions, and then he makes the Rosso, which is the kind of the blend. So, just a few words on Montalcino in general. So it's an interesting little area. So whereas we were talking with Paula before about the long history of Sangiovese throughout Tuscany, Montalcino is quite the opposite. It's quite the new kid on the block. So in the 1960s, there were 11 producers and there was 63.5 hectares of Montalcino. In 2012, there were 258 producers and there were almost 2,000 hectares. So it's gone through a bit of an exponential growth over the past 40 years. So the one really important thing to remember is that we are over 100 kilometers south of Florence. So it is, as we said at the very start, it is a big area. It's a long drive, and the temperature and the climate changes a lot going from Florence, which is quite inland, towards the sea down in Montalcino. So it's all about elevation. Mont, of course, means mountain. It is a big, high, elevated area, which, as Paula was saying, that elevation gives you exposure during the day, but the temperatures drop overnight. It gets really quite cold. It is also closer to the sea. It gets a beautiful sea breeze in the afternoon. So that cools the vines if it gets too hot during the summer. And it is also the most arid DOCG in the entirety of Tuscany. Yeah. So it gets something like 300 millimeters less than anywhere else. And as Paula mentioned, of course, irrigation is completely illegal. So if it's drier, it's just drier. You just have to deal with it. So many of you would have heard of Brunello di Montalcino. Brunello is the local word for Sangiovese. So again, we're talking about 100% Sangiovese, as we have with all of these wines. And this area has been split now into 4 different sub-regions, which produces different wines, basically. So it depends what side of the slope you're on. So where the sun rises, who gets the morning sun, the afternoon sun. But there's also a split throughout the middle, basically right through the middle of Montalcino. To the north is a very different soil called Galestro soil, which is very, very famous throughout all of Tuscany, this Galestro soil. And that produces very elegant, aromatic, lighter wines. To the south, because there was a riverbed that used to run through the southern area, that's got a clay level over the top of it. So that produces more dense, tannic, thick, heavy wines.
Yeah, I think in short, isn't it? The wines of Montalcino are the biggest expression of Tuscany. They're rich, big wines, except these Rossos that we've got. I think I'm probably right in saying the grapes will ripen here, Paula, a week to 10 days earlier, probably, than where you are.
I mean, in Chianti Classico, even north of me, they're about 2-3 weeks ahead of me. So okay. Montalcino is probably, oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I never pick Sangiovese before October, and then for sure pick some of it in September. Yeah.
Without doubt, yeah. So the Brunello is obviously the most famous and the most popular example of wine from Montalcino. Rosso di Montalcino is the level down, which is basically the more easier drinking style. So Rosso it must be aged for a minimum of 1 year, 6 months of which must be in oak. And that's what we have here with the Val di Suga Rosso di Montalcino. So Ali, anything you wanted to add in about Montalcino?
No, I don't think so. I think it's interesting there, because we've talked just about how Brunello is this big, rich wine, and then we've shown you a Rosso, and actually this isn't really a big, rich wine. This is quite a light, accessible wine, and that's the key with Rosso. I don't think there are actually specific rules as to what makes a Rosso, except that Mark said about aging. I think it can be often from young vines. But it's just something they can get to market more quickly and is more accessible, because the top Brunellos, top Montalcino wines are very, very expensive now. It was made famous by a winery, Biondi Santi, and then you had Gianfranco Soldera, another famous one. So these are very, very expensive wines, and this is just to give people a little snapshot. It's often called a baby Brunello. And how much do we sell this one for, Luke?
I think this one goes for about 55.
55, okay. Yeah, and this is just a really easy entry-level step into Brunello. And what Brunellos do we also carry? I should know this.
We also have the Val di Suga Brunello as well, which is
Of course we do.
Andrea's top Brunello as well. So
Top Brunello, yeah. I think it's really interesting, and to see the difference between the two. So I'd recommend everyone go and buy a bottle of that, and then do a tasting next to each other, and you'll see there's a much more dense expression of Tuscany, that rich, almost fruitcakey character. But on here, it's all just lovely, lively red fruit, easy drinking, delicious expression of Sangiovese. Cherries. We haven't actually talked too much about what are the hallmarks of Sangiovese. I think often it can be a dried herb, tomato leaf, dark cherry. And I think I've said in a couple of the other weeks, there's often, and without wanting to be generic about Italy, that a slight bitterness to the fruit from Sangiovese, as well as from Nebbiolo, and from Montalcino and from Nero di Avola, this sort of bitter character, and that comes through in Sangiovese as well. So yeah, this is just a really nice 13.5%, easy to drink, entry level to Montalcino.
Yeah, good little intro. Yeah, but just to back up what Ali's saying, I mean, you look at the wines of Biondi Santi, and they are really approaching kind of Barolo cru level quality and prices. They're the kind of $400 or $500 dollars a bottle, so they're definitely up there. So Luke, any questions we have considered?
No, we're currently arranging a trip to Paula's estate, so that's going to be good.
It is honestly one of the most beautiful parts of the world you will find.
Why did we taste?
Sorry, Graham, can you say that one again?
Yeah, I have a question, and that is, we didn't spend a lot of time talking about the wines, but if you were having a wine tasting, I would have thought you would have started with the Rosso, then the Classico, and then the Reserva, and that would have been a logical sequence.
That's most definitely a good. That most definitely is a good point. I'll be honest, I was expecting the Rosso to be a little bit bigger and rounder and broader than. Last time I tried it, it was a little bit bigger. It softened quite a lot.
Yeah.
The last few months, definitely. So, but look, we've done it. We've not quite backwards, but it's nice to kind of finish on a bit of a lighter, elegant one. So,
yeah, fine.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on the wines from anyone, or any other questions?
Feel free to just unmute your microphone if you would like to ask a question.
I could say everyone.
We thought the Reserva was just fabulous.
The Reserva, yeah. I think I'm in agreement. That really is an outstanding wine, and it does stand out as the trio. And I meant to say to Paula earlier on that she recently has had some really superb scores from Walter Speller, who's a colleague of mine at Jancis Robinson, and Walter's a massive fan of Le Macine, and it's great to see that she's getting the recognition as well from journalists globally. As we've heard her fantastic story coming in as an outsider, not being accepted, and it's great that we can share these wines with you. But I agree, I think that's the standout wine, and the wine that really made us go, we need to share these wines with you guys.
Absolutely. No,
and just to say, we still have a few in stock, so if you would like some, it's there.
Is it a good example, however, of the Tuscan wines, of the Sangioveses of that? The Sangioveses of that area.
Is it a good expression? I would say what it is going back to how Paula explained it, is it's probably, yes, it is a good expression. It does show typicity, but probably elevated to another level due to her attention to detail, I think, and sometimes, as you'll know, with many things in life, it takes an outsider to come in with fresh eyes and just not, you have a respect for the tradition of an area, but just to be able to think slightly laterally and have a wider vision of what you can do. And I think that's what Paula's done, being she's a bundle of energy, and she talked earlier on about how she would vinify different parcels individually. And I think what she's doing is that attention to detail, that external view. You guys have done it for many years. And it's just like sport, as I think I said before. A lot of sports were invented in England, but we're just not that very good at them. Everyone else, the Kiwis have mastered the rugby. You guys have sort of mastered the cricket, although I'm not.
What about the cricket?
So I think often, having an external vision can really add something. So yes, they're classic, but I think elevated to another level.
Perfect.
Paula, is there anything that you'd like to add at all?
Well, I think one thing that we didn't talk about really is the fact that these wines, because Ali was talking about kind of the grit, the kind of bitterness, and all of these things that are Sangiovese, being a grape that's less polished, make it so friendly. These wines just ask for food, right? And that's always been what Italian wines are about. So whenever you taste an Italian wine and you get, oh, wow, this has got that tannin, this has got that acidity, it's not quite, round and easy. As soon as you stick it with food, you're like, oh my God, this is great. Yeah. So I think that is really important, is the whole connection that old school, old world wines have with food.
And that absolutely has been a common thread throughout the tastings we've done these past 3 weeks, has been Italian wine is such a central part of Italian culture in general. It's something that I said in week 1 was wine in Italy is not a privilege, it is a right. And it's on the table every night, as it should be.
Brilliant. Yeah, and you've seen on the last picture, Mark's managed to put a picture of us when we went jogging.
Shameless plug of us as we ran through the hills of Montalcino.
Oh yeah, there you go.
Yeah, we've been indulging in quite a lot of the local cuisine. I think we had a nice bistecca Florentina when we went out for dinner, didn't we, Paula? And we were doing that regularly. So this was us trying to burn off some of that excess pasta.
It's the alcohol and the food.
It was a fine. That's why I've got my shades on. It wasn't that sunny. It was just to hide my eyes.
Very good. So thank you very much, Ali and Paula. Especially thank you to Paula. That was such an enlightening experience to have you along. It was fantastic to get your story directly from you. I know Ali and I met you face to face, and we could see how much energy that you exude in person, and I think that's really clearly come across even from the other side of the world. It's just been fantastic to see you again, and it's
so lovely to be here.
My customers to see you as well. It's been so great. So
yeah, likewise. I echo those words, and it's great. And we're really happy that we can represent you and share these wines in Australia. And let's hope you have another great vintage coming up.
Yes.
Yes. I hope so. It's so lovely to see everybody all the way across the world. Thank you for buying my wines and supporting me at a very far distance. It's wonderful.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Bye from us.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks everyone for coming. Sorry, we ran a little bit over the hour. Sorry about that.
That's not a problem. It was excellent. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Luke.
Cheers, guys. Take care.
See you all next week.